Congo, it would be no comparison. Well, so, you know, it's kind of odd that so much attention has been received has been focused on Darfur. In many ways, would say it hasn't gotten enough coverage, which I would agree with. But nonetheless, you know, for a humanitarian situation, it's gotten quite a bit of press coverage in the U.S., in the West. Well, we can look at other cases of violence that have basically been ignored. But the question is, why Darfur? I mean, we know it's not based on objective criteria of the depth of the crisis, such as the number of people killed or the number of people displaced or raped or so on, because we can see from the Congo that the dearth of coverage there disproves that. Well, my argument is that the reason is because Darfur is a politically useful crisis in the West. So the perpetrators of the violence identify as Muslim Arabs, which is useful bogeyman in the post-September 11th era. More importantly, however, Washington isn't backing them. So Darfur is a crime scene that the U.S. government can point to with righteous indignation and scold the bad guys and look very moral. And that's an important thing when you're involved in all sorts of crimes elsewhere. Well, I'll come back to this argument, but let's just take one other case of humanitarian disaster, a disaster that hasn't received the same character of coverage as Darfur. As it happens, it makes for almost an ideal case study because the violence there also began in early 2003 and peaked and then tapered off over a similar timeline. Granted, the scale of the violence is different, so in this case, far more people have been killed, some 600,000 according to the best epidemiological study, which was done in the height of the violence, so later projections give a much higher figure. But even taking that conservative estimate of deaths, it's twice what was estimated for Darfur. Well, also just to look at the number of displaced, it's a similar number, about 2 million. Well, the country I'm talking about, of course, is Iraq. Well, of course, Iraq has received a fair amount of media coverage, but it's of a very different character. So, reportage tends to focus on the internecine political conflicts and alliances and looks at the strategies of the Pentagon and the White House to continue the occupation and so on. It's very rarely framed as a massive humanitarian disaster, which of course it is. So contrast that with Darfur, where the internal politics received little attention and the depth of the humanitarian crisis and the evil of the perpetrators is highlighted. And Darfur was regularly described in the press a couple years ago as the world's worst humanitarian disaster. It was sort of the boilerplate that would come at the end of all the articles. Again, it's hard to explain that based on the numbers. Well, let's return to why Darfur is a favorite crisis. First of all, this is nothing new. So in the late 70s, Cambodia was ruled by Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, and he was committing terrible crimes that killed huge numbers of people. And for a time, the Western media were full of moral indignation and denunciations about what was happening. At the same time, elsewhere in Asia, in a tiny island called East Timor, it was being attacked by the Indonesian military, which was receiving arms from Washington. Some 200,000 people were ultimately killed. There was virtually no coverage in the media. Okay, so why? Well, there was one difference and between the two cases, and that was that in East Timor, Washington could actually do something about it. So they were supplying the killers. They were arming the Indonesian military. So you just had to stop supplying the weapons. Well, in Cambodia, no one really had any idea what to do about it. I think the parallels with Darfur today are pretty clear. So obviously, Washington has responsibility for the violence in Iraq, but it's also had its hand in the Congo through its allies Rwanda and Uganda, which have regularly invaded Congo in the past, infringed upon its territory, and are very deeply implicated in the conflict. Okay, well, this is something any good propaganda system or even a child for that matter, can appreciate. If you're doing something bad, change the topic to something you can claim the moral high ground on. Never mind that you can't do too much about it. So focusing on Darfur is a good diversion from what Washington is doing in Palestine, Colombia, Somalia, and the list just kind of goes on. That doesn't mean we should ignore what's happening in Darfur, certainly. But it's a bit odd to make it the principal focus of national organizing. I mean, what would we think if Chinese activists devoted all their attention to campaigning against the US occupation of Iraq? It would be bizarre, right? I mean, what can they hope to really do? Well, that's the political context for the Darfur crisis, but one question remains, which is, what, if anything, can we do about it? Okay, well, let's just first take a look at what has been done before we get to what can be done. There's been a remarkable amount of activism around Darfur in the US, particularly on college campuses, and as well as kind of led by a few well-funded NGOs and nonprofits. The umbrella group for most of this is the Save Darfur Coalition, which was founded in 2005, and it's quite unusual for an activist group. So its budget for the last fiscal year was $15 million, and it has a lot of Fortune 500 companies as donors and so on. I mean, compare that with the United for Justice and Peace, which is the main anti-war group that organizes all those rallies against the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's like night and day. Well, so Darfur, I'm just going to refer to Save Darfur as sort of the catch-all term for the activist establishment around the issue. It also gained traction with politicians and the media with remarkable ease. So major op-ed writers like Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times, who has been one of the columnists who's focused most consistently on Darfur throughout the years, writes such things like, I quote him, "For all the failures, there is something inspiring about how hundreds of thousands of university students around America have marched, fasted, and donated money on behalf of people of a different race and religion who live halfway around the world in a land that they never heard of 5 years ago and who rarely appear on their television screens." Well, I mean, okay, it's hard to disagree with that. The sentiments are certainly true, but just contrast that with how the press has covered the anti-war demonstrations. I mean, good luck finding similar words of praise in the op-ed columns. In fact, we can assess the disparities in coverage objectively, because we again happen to have something that makes a very good case study. In April of 2006, on the same weekend, there was a demonstration for action in Darfur in Washington, D.C., and another demonstration against the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan in New York City. Well, despite the, by all accounts, much larger turnout at the anti-war march, the newspapers across the country prominently highlighted the Darfur rally while paying only fleeting attention to the anti-war protest. And there are plenty of other examples of the open doors for the Save Darfur Coalition. So, for one thing, we can see an array of celebrities who have been speaking out on Darfur and making it their sort of cause of choice. Not just George Clooney and Don Cheadle, but also Matt Damon, Mia Farrow, John Legend, and a long list of others. And the White House is also favorably inclined to Save Darfur, despite the mild criticisms Darfur activists directed them. So, for instance, Scott Gratian, who's the U.S. Special Envoy to Sudan, he spoke recently at a Save Darfur event in New York City. I mean, can you imagine anyone from the Obama administration speaking at an anti-war event? And this is the candidate who was the so-called anti-war candidate. Well, you know, it's too much of a chasm, it wouldn't happen. But when it comes to Darfur, politicians regularly praise the activists. So Barack Obama has called for, quote, pressure from ordinary individuals standing together for an extraordinary cause, and said that we need greater pressure from the American public to tell their senators this is something we are paying attention to. You heard similar fulsome language from the Bush administration too. Again, I think this is because Darfur, as an issue, does not conflict with Washington's agenda.